Good morning, everybody, and my name is Ray Uzaitis, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to be emceeing the proceedings today. I'm the president of NSTech, and I'm on behalf of NSTech as well as the Nevada site office. I'm greeting everybody who's come here today and who's listening across the complex. It is a historically significant event that we're commemorating today. Some folks we've had some debate. Is it an anniversary? Is it a celebration? Clearly, to those of us who were involved back in the early 90s in the nuclear enterprise, it's not really a celebration, because I still remember taking a petition from the weapon designers to Sig Hecker saying, you can't let this happen. You know, on the other hand, life goes on its own, the earth turns on its own axis. So. However, it is an anniversary of a very significant event. I would like to acknowledge that the entire, we think the entire complex is listening in or tuning in via VTC, and like to welcome all of those of you physically here as well as those in the remote sites. This proceedings will be video recorded, hence there will not be any breaks in the agenda. So I'm hoping everybody is ready for that. So September 23rd, 1992 was a special day. I guess that's the day that we are celebrating the anniversary of today. The United States executed Divider, which was the last U.S. nuclear test in the Julin series. That year there were 8, which is significantly down from the 96 that we executed in 1962 when the United States came out of the moratorium. And it is a bittersweet day. It's on the order for those of us who are in the nuclear weapons enterprise, RD&T. It's maybe as significant to other Americans who say, hey, where were you when President Kennedy was shot? Or where were you when the Twin Towers came down? Where were you when the Berlin Wall came down? At the risk of presumption, I would say that those of us in the nuclear business, will remember and say, where were we when Divider, was executed? I personally was scientific advisor. I had just received my stripes as scientific advisor from the Nauvoo office, so I was in both my first and last role in that. Larry Krenzine, it was a test director. Jim Magruder was a test controller. I see Jim there. Nick Aquilina was the Nauvoo manager at the time, and gave a stirring speech at the end of that, when we executed the test, which gave us sort of a foretaste of what was to come. Many of us were getting prepared for the end of testing, but we at that time thought, well, maybe there are a few more. We were always talking about what the last 10 or 15 of these tests would look like, or what we should do. But when it comes, it sort of comes, as a surprise to everybody in the end. I personally had just gotten a call that I was going to start my position as X-Division leader the following week. And so I know my thoughts at that day was, what are we going to do, in the design division when we don't have a nuclear test that served as the flywheel and really the motivating and organizing principle of our technical careers. It was sort of an interesting day. So I think all of us will reflect on those days today, and I think the discussions that we will have, the presentations, will provide a context. Yesterday we had a great series of technical discussions about all of the technical achievements and insights that have been gained through a series of subcritical tests for the last 20 years. But today I think is more dedicated towards contextual discussion of where are we in stockpile stewardship, and where are we going, what is the role of the test site, what is the role of experimentation, simulation, and in the end I think we'll all be able to truly celebrate that we are still here 20 years after testing went away, because I think a lot of folks would not have bet that was going to happen on September 23rd, 1992. So this is as an introduction to our first speaker, Gary Wall, who yesterday introduced himself as a bridge. I think at dinner he said, "Yeah, I'm a bridge," and I thought I'll give you his bio first, and I'll make some personal comments. Gary has 41 years of experience in primary design and analysis and has been a lab fellow at Los Alamos since 2005. He was a member of primary design teams on 25 nuclear tests and lead designer on another 7 nuclear tests. He's designed and analyzed hydro tests and other hydrodynamic experiments to investigate physics issues important in the design and understanding of primaries, and has participated in testing and validation of new physics models implemented in the design codes. Gary served as a group leader at a very important time, a group leader of the primary design group for 5.5 years, guiding that group, X4 at the time, through the transition from nuclear testing to stockpile stewardship without nuclear testing. So he was faced with some of the same issues. How do we organize our technical expertise and the talent we have in the design organizations when we've lost this flywheel? But significant for September 23rd, Gary was also a member of the primary design team on Divider, which was the last U.S. nuclear test, and he is now currently the principal investigator on the scaling and surrogacy and Gemini projects, which means that he has clearly bridged that gap between September 23rd, 92 and today. More personally, I've known Gary for all these years, and he exhibits the perfect kind of an example of what you would think a bridge would do. He's been a mentor to so many designers at Los Alamos. And design groups, I'm sure at Livermore as well as at Los Alamos, always had some turmoil. There's always the old guard and there's always a new guard. The young Turks and the old Turks, and I won't say what we used to call them in those days, but they're Turks. Nevertheless, Gary had always been there as somebody who was able to bridge those two design cultures. And I am happy to see him still in that role today and in the Castor and Pollock series that we just conducted. So Gary is the best person to lead off this discussion today. So please welcome Gary Wall to the podium.
Thank you, Ray. I would like to offer my appreciation for the opportunity to address such an august collection of people, and it's an honor to have been a bridge in this design effort. As you see, my title is From Divider to Gemini, an old primary designer's perspective. I'm not really that old. The shot named Divider proved to be prophetic in hindsight. At the time we fired Divider, we had no idea it was going to be the last test. Negotiations were going between Los Alamos and Livermore and Washington, trying to decide what the last few tests were that we were going to be allowed to do before the moratorium kicked in. And then we kind of got surprised not very long after Divider. In fact, the rack for the next test, called Ice Cap, was already in place over the hole, and we were ready to field that test very soon after Divider, and unfortunately that one didn't happen. Divider was a very successful test. It tested a design concept that still has use in going forward with options in the stockpile in the future. I have to say, I was one of the people that was extremely pessimistic when we got the word. This was the analogy I used at the time. When we had nuclear testing, we felt like we had the tools we needed to do the job. Without nuclear testing, I had concerns that we didn't have the tools any longer. And so I took this analogy as the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I think in hindsight, that was a little bit pessimistic. As Ray said, I became group leader in the design groups shortly after that. By the way, it was a privilege to work under Ray. And we had to show some leadership in doing the transition to how we would do the job of what became known as stockpile stewardship without nuclear testing. Before divider, new nuclear tests were the foundation for doing stockpile stewardship and the methodology for certifying stockpile. We had full-scale surrogate experiments, and the tradition was we would do full-scale surrogate experiments. We would simulate that as well as we could, but there wasn't a whole lot of effort to make those simulations perfect, because then we went on to the full-scale nuclear test, and it was the results of the full-scale nuclear test and the simulation of those that we then used to make stockpile predictions and certification. The piece in the middle called full-scale plutonium hydrodynamic state, that was done by simulations. We did a model that matched the hydrodynamic test as well as possible, and then we put plutonium in the simulation, and then we moved forward to the simulation of the nuclear test. That was our methodology for taking care of the stockpile. The model predictions used a small set of relevant nuclear tests for that system, so nuclear test tie points. So we used those to predict performance for the stockpile over the predicted lifetime of that system in the stockpile, and typically that was about 20 years. We used tests in what we called near neighbor systems as well, but we really had those tie points that were directly relevant to the system that we were trying to certify. Without nuclear testing now, we have a much longer period to take care of that system in the stockpile, something considerably longer than 20 years. And so those relevant tests move to the left in that timeline and become a little bit, or at least more suspect in terms of their relevance for predicting what's happening out there toward the right. And unlike good wine, nuclear systems don't age well and don't improve with age. After divider, thanks to Vic Reese, we got what we call Stockpile Stewardship Program to start trying to fill the gaps that we use to rely on nuclear tests. We got new experimental facilities, and some examples of those are the DART facility at Los Alamos, dual axis hydrodynamic test facility with very high quality radiographic machines, the Z machine at Sandia, UNA at NNSS, and radiographic and pin shot capabilities at Livermore. We had also new diagnostic capabilities, the Cygnus radiographic capability in UNA. We had proton radiography at Los Alamos, and a new diagnostic photon Doppler velocimetry that we just fielded on the Pollux experiment extremely successfully last week, and I think that's kind of revolutionizing the amount and quality of data that we can use to characterize implosions. There's good and bad with that. The additional constraints that are put on the simulations are what I would call both exhilarating and at the same time frustrating, because what we typically find out is that our simulation models just aren't up to the task, but that's what feeds back into making improvements in those simulations. I have always thought and still think that the greatest single technical challenge for primary design and assessment is understanding the dynamic behavior of plutonium. We kind of skipped over that quite a bit when we were doing nuclear testing because we had the nuclear test to validate our simulations. When we don't have that going forward, understanding that behavior over a wide range of temperature and pressure is still our greatest challenge, and a lot of the experimental effort that we've been aiming at since divider is trying to do that. Subcritical experiments that were mentioned, those are extremely valuable in the absence of nuclear testing. We are able to drive plutonium with high explosive. That gives us the opportunity to investigate the dynamic properties of plutonium in the right regimes relevant to primaries, and that's been extremely useful but also extremely challenging. In the area of computing and simulation, under stockpile stewardship, we've had exponential increases in the high performance computing capabilities. We've had incredible advances in the visualization tools that we use to analyze the results of very large simulations. And we've got new simulation codes and improved physics models that go along with that. So in short, Stockpile Stewardship has been very successful in helping us get new tools for the job we have to do. Other developments that help us with predictive capability, there's been a lot of reanalysis and systematic archiving of the diagnostic data from nuclear tests that were done before Divider. We're increasing the use of what we call common models, where you try to use a common approach to model a bunch of nuclear tests over a bunch of different systems, and that helps identify the shortcomings in your simulation tools. Analysis and simulation of previously ignored nuclear test diagnostics. In large part, when we were doing nuclear tests, the diagnostic capability was way ahead of our ability to simulate those diagnostics, and still today we're going back and looking at those diagnostics and trying to understand how to simulate those and get a better understanding of what was going on in those tests. In addition, there's a typo here, we can reanalyze anomalies that appeared in the nuclear tests with new simulation capabilities. In some cases, those new capabilities help us understand that it wasn't an anomaly, it was just our lack of understanding. But there still are some anomalies out there that we still need to work on. So now we've got subcritical experiments like Gemini, and we can use those to help fill some of our gaps in our approach to predicting stockpile performance. So we still have we have full-scale experiments in the lower left. We now have scaled experiments in the upper left. Those both feed into simulation models and help us understand how the scaled data relates to full-scale data. We can also do scale plutonium experiments. That helps us relate the behavior of the surrogate material to the plutonium behavior. Both of those put together help us better understand how to simulate the full-scale plutonium hydrodynamic behavior, which gives us a jump point for moving forward to the nuclear performance and stockpile predictions. So we're not left without arms and legs. The challenges that I see going forward, maintaining what I call a healthy skepticism toward what the simulation results are giving us. And I think we need to look at multiple ways to validate the simulations instead of just accepting what the calculation tells us. Maintaining design expertise is another challenge. That's what I say is in addition to just analysis techniques. We need to be designing, predicting, fielding, and analyzing the results from new experiments, and in particular dynamic plutonium experiments. We can conduct blind tests where we test the ability of younger designers to predict the results of a nuclear test that we did in the past without knowing what the answer is in advance. That's proving to be extremely valuable. Another challenge is attracting and retaining bright young scientists, and I should have added engineers there as well. Given that we're not doing nuclear tests, some of the excitement has gone for a lot of the people that were involved in those days. But I think there is a lot of excitement in the way we do things now that we can use to help retain bright young people. And finally, we need to continue to push the envelope in experiments and computational capabilities to do the job. Thank you.
The next speaker is Dr. David Crandall. Dave, along with Vic Reese, Robin Staff, and Gil Wygand in those days, created quite a force at, I guess it wasn't NNSA right at the beginning, at the defense programs, for to establish the stewardship program and to ensure that the role of science and good science was never left apart from that program. Dave was a great conscience in that regard, my personal reflection. Dave has been at the U.S. Department of Energy in Washington since 1983. He is currently an advisor on national security and inertial fusion to the Undersecretary for Science at DOE. His experience includes 16 years of physics research, 28 years of science program management, and 3 years as chief scientist for the National Nuclear Security Administration, the NNSA. He's led significant scientific programs in plasma physics and fusion energy and in nuclear weapons stockpile stewardship prior to his current role. In 1995, Dave joined the Office of Defense Programs, where he served as director of the Office of National Ignition Facility, Inertial Fusion, and Defense Sciences, and then as the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Research Development and Simulation, before becoming NNSA's Chief Scientist. Please welcome Dr. David Crandall to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you, Ray, and thank you, everybody. I have an affection for being close to the Nevada Proving Ground, as Troy Wade tells me it was originally named. It has other names now. Like many people here, people who come here just get attached to that place and enjoy it and love it. Steve Sturbins and Frank Saverna are back there. I was once at a conference and out to dinner with them and some others. And it came up, where are you staying? And they both said, out at the Nevada test site. And I said, what's going on out there? Why are you staying out there? And he said, we prefer it. So there you go. First of all, stockpile stewardship is viewed as a success. This is sort of the Washington take, but from the Commission in 2009, it is viewed as a success, and you're going to hear some about that today. Here's the guy who started it. This is one of my favorite pictures. I own this picture. It was drawn by Mike Campbell, but everybody recognizes Vic Reese. And Vic would have been giving this talk today, but he's out pursuing his current passion, which is small modular nuclear reactors, if anybody didn't know. But he's had the vision and started an original discussion in '93 with Hazel O'Leary. And his main point to Hazel, and he repeated it in different ways, was that the future of nuclear deterrence depends on the labs and the state of health of the labs. In my view, the Stockpile Stewardship Program initiation was with the submission of a document in 1995, which is cited there. These are some of the early events, and I'm not going to go over this in detail, but just point out that from '93 to '95 was a pretty active time. And Vic led a lot of activities which included the Navigators and the Science Council and some activities with additional people, all getting to what are we talking about with stockpile stewardship. And the biggest single point was nuclear tests and what do we think about nuclear tests in the future and how did we get to zero yield. Vic has this note. I have the copy of this note. One of the pleasures of my life is I get to see Vic almost every day. The advisors are not doing too much right now, but we will get back to it when we get an Undersecretary for Science. But he articulated very well the prospect of helping to define the nuclear future and designing contingencies for that future without nuclear tests is a critical challenge worthy of our best minds. And it couldn't have happened without people like Gary. Really couldn't. How did it get to be zero? There was a lot of discussion and an important conference, a so-called Stockpile Confidence Conference, which I was not at, but I see Steve nodding. He remembers it well and some of the follow-ups to it. There was a lot of discussion about what could the U.S. actually do, but there was a significant input from Sid Drell to Hazel O'Leary, and Hazel carried the day, zero yield. Now, like many diplomatic things, zero has never been well defined, and it won't be. But we adhere to it pretty well. Who am I? This is pointing out who I am, but I wanted to have this view graph up for two reasons. One is, Ray mentioned you remember where you were on certain dates. I remember where I was on 2001 9/11. I was here. And I remember that Tom D'Agostino was my deputy at that time. And that was an interesting relationship that has still continued. But the important thing here is the NNSA laboratories did all the real work and were even fun at times, Ray. This is a picture of the cover of the document that started Stockpile Stewardship. Here's a page from it. I won't try to show that. Gary already talked about the challenge of the weapons getting significantly older. But I wanted to put up this to remind myself, because in looking through things I remembered. Made this up in about 1998 or 99, and it didn't get used a lot because it always caused so much controversy. But it illustrates the fact that here we were a few years after the start of the Stockpile Stewardship Program, and for me, we hadn't settled on how we were going to do this yet. We were still struggling with that. I don't know what Gary's recollection may be. He can straighten that out, but to my view, we still didn't have a full understanding of how we were accomplishing this. This was this notion that after the end of testing, there would be a decline in confidence in the stockpile. And the intent of the stockpile, of the stewardship program, was to arrest that or even improve it with science basis. And we started doing that in this time frame. And additional facilities, a real understanding that computing would play a major role, and getting people like Gary, like many others, who were well-versed in the stockpile and in the stockpile history and testing to really grasp on to what it was we were trying to do and how it could work. But we didn't have a very clear notion of the outcome, and stocktake does not refer to the usual U.S.-British meeting. It was the idea that we should assess ourselves as to where we were at some periods in the future with this. But that really was something that I made up and that reflected at the time that we were struggling with. Where are we going? In 2001, I remember reporting to the National Academy, and we put down these major goals. And I won't try to read those. You can read them if you want to. But certify the performance and safety of any rebuilt or aged primary to within a specified margin. The specific margin was classified at the time, probably still is. That was and I think still is viewed as the primary challenge of trying to do stockpile stewardship. But we have maintained essentially those goals. But there was still the question of how to go about that. And to me, the central feature that brought us home and which brings us back to this test history and connects us back to the test history is something called quantifications of margins and uncertainty, which Ray and Bruce Goodwin will remember well, that they lived it for several years before we got to sort of what I called agreement. From headquarters, we said, we need something better from the labs in which we can understand what you're doing and you can argue about it more effectively. That is, have some common understandings and terminology. And they named it quantifications of margins and uncertainties. In fact, Bruce told me that Lloyd Malthoff made the name.
He invented the concept.
Well, the concept is a pretty standard engineering concept.
Invented the name.
Okay. For a while, we called it figures of Mike after Mike Anastasio, but it was roughly in this time frame that we conducted some workshops and tried to understand how are we going to make this clearer to people. Part of the problem was that Congress in particular, but in a sense even the administration, senior people in the government said, what are you talking about with stockpile stewardship? What do you mean? How do we understand what you're doing? And how do we get confidence that you understand what you're doing? This white paper was issued in 2003. I have the original copy. I'll show you a picture of the cover in a minute. That came from Ray and Bruce to me. And it was a significant, a signature moment in the stockpile stewardship history for me, was receiving that paper. That was the first time we had something written down about quantification of margins uncertainty, and it's gone on quite a ways from there. But I'll point out that we had a significant review in 2007 by the National Academy, and that really was sort of then recognizing that there we were. Here it is, 32803. This appears on my desk, and I was delighted to get it. And among other things, that was the first time I saw this chart, which was the usual representation. We've changed it in many ways, but to understand the confidence ratios that we still use in depicting quantification of margins and uncertainty. So what was this? This was really advanced computing and stockpile history being put together. The advanced computing, we learned how to do a lot of things, both in the experimental side to test or validate those codes, which still get tested and validated and frustrate the owners. And significant progress was made in the science basis for this. But the notion was that we would continue a serial development, spiral development of the codes and the capabilities, and that there were knobs that tune the codes, and that if we really made progress in understanding, we should be able to soak those knobs out. And the real test of the codes that we use is, do they represent the stockpile test history? That's the main metric that's applied to understand whether we're making progress or not. If you can explain a broader range of tests, you probably made an improvement, probably, subject to other tests as well. But this was the notion, and it's guiding us yet today. We went through some other changes. One of the interesting ones, and Jim Capsalis, who was my introduction to the annual assessment process, came and visited me the other day, and we had a great time. So he's high on my mind. But in sort of this time frame where we got QMU established, we also went through some other changes. And Sam Bodman in particular, and then later Steve Chu, had a different view of how the Secretary of Energy should be involved in this, and began to say, give us this information, the quantifications report, get Sandia engaged. We did this originally with Los Alamos and Livermore because that's where the problems were. But Sandia had an important role in this and really helped define quantification of margins of uncertainty as much as the other labs did when they brought the sort of engineering fundamentals to the table. We began to do a watch list for each warhead and bomb and things that we saw in the stockpile which weren't significant findings yet, but which we understood could become such. And so those were important. And SAGSAT had been, and still is, reviewing the health of the stockpile for Stratcom commander. And we actually got Bob Selden to come in and brief Secretary Bodman. That was a first. And Tom D'Agostino turned to me in the middle of the whole process and says, we have never told the Secretary what our opinion is from the headquarters staff. So we started doing that as well. But it was clearly understood that the opinions that mattered and what was being brought to the table, where all these things were views on it, the opinions that mattered were the lab directors. And the lab directors owned the certification of the stockpile, and that got reinforced in some additional ways. We went through a questioning of how do we do peer review, particularly with respect to the stockpile, and went through some period of time discussing it and came to some new arrangements or slightly different arrangements, but the number one feature of those arrangements was to codify that the authority for certification of the stockpile is the lab directors. And we established that each warhead had a home, New Mexico or California, and that each warhead, that the data on which certification was based ought to be fully exchangeable. And so we got increased exchange of data and established red teams that were, if the home was Nevada, New Mexico, the home was New Mexico, the California team was the red team. They did report, however, to the lab director in New Mexico, who was the certification authority for that, lab directors in New Mexico. That was a fairly significant event for me. You could read the whole thing if you wanted to, but interestingly, we put this together, we did a lot of work on it, and that's Steve Chew's signature. It's the one of the first things he did was to canonize that revised peer review process, which all sits in the QMU and goes with the background. Another thing we did, and I'll just point this out, is to recognize that the labs have and Nevada test site in those days, have a broader role in national security, sort of advertising that to the world and rebranding ourselves in a sense that nuclear security is the middle name for National Nuclear Security Administration, and we intend to live up to it. And Sam Bodman signed out a document to do that. So, bottom line summary is stockpile stewardship got started in this way, was successful. QMU, with advances in computing connected to the test history, provided the basis and benefits science and security more broadly than just the stockpile. And we are in a transition still, and continuously, I would say, since I got involved with stockpile stewardship. And I do remember Jim Magruder. He gave me my first tour of the test site in 1995, along with Jim Van Fleet. Thanks, Jim. Science is key to all of the paths forward. We expect to be certifying stockpile for a number of years to come, extending the life of the current design nuclear warheads, which is a significant challenge. In some ways, it might be harder than building new ones. Science is the basis. If we tend to zero, which the president has said is the ultimate goal, science will still be the basis. The science basis that has been created through the tests that were done and through the efforts of the scientists, the laboratories who brought us stockpile stewardship, will continue almost indefinitely, because you can't take away what these devices are and the fact that they can be made. So, science basis, test history, affection for the test site. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And just another personal reflection. The Science-Based Stewardship Program has really set a standard in science and technology in the United States on reflection. I have the honor of serving on the Nuclear Energy Advisory Council, which is the Secretary's advisory body for advising on nuclear energy, civilian nuclear energy in the country. And one of the things that we were talking about was instituting a program of science-based prediction of nuclear reactor codes, because I thought our weapons codes were bad. The reactor codes, and this is like years ago, they're very poor. And if you think about what it takes to have a nuclear renaissance and how you make the business case for nuclear energy in this country, science-based prediction could help a lot in reducing the amount of empiricism and the margins that, that underlie their regulatory processes. But and they have all the good language, and we use ASCII. We used ASCII as a reference point, and Office of Science has OSCAR and SIDAC, and they're similar. But ultimately, it's the resources. They were only willing, and this is not one person, but the enterprise was only capable of funding that at $23 million. And when you look at that kind of a resource, and then you tie it to what's critically important is have the experimental data, because this is something that we struggled with. It's always this tension between simulation and experiment. If you think about the cost of experiments to do in the nuclear reactor world, it's maybe not as big as our costs, but they just don't have the resources to muster that kind of technical program that could be transformational. So I think, for me personally, it was a reflection on, wow, how proud I was to have been involved in science-based stewardship in the weapons program, because clearly we were faced with a challenge of certification without testing that sort of spurred the resources. But the dollars do matter in the end. So, next I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Deeney. Dr. Christopher Deeney is the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Stockpile Stewardship at the U.S. Department of Energy's NNSA. He's responsible for a $1.7 billion portfolio, that's a lot more than $23 million, that encompasses 3 offices within NNSA's Office of Defense Programs: Defense Science, Inertial Confinement Fusion, and Advanced Simulation and Computing and Institutional R&D programs. In 1995, Dr. Deeney joined Sandia National Labs, where he had been one of the experimenters on the 8 megaamp Saturn and 20 megaamp Z-pulse power generators, where he did pioneering research on high wire number arrays and nested wire arrays. In 2005, Chris became a senior manager at Sandia, responsible for the Pulse Power Technology Group. And in 2006, he joined the NNSA in the position of Director for the Office of Defense Science, and since 2010, as the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Stockpile Stewardship. So, Dr. Deeney, Chris Deeney, I welcome you to the podium.
Thanks, Ray. And your introductory comments were a good setup before you introduced me for what I'm about to show you. So I'm building on things that you heard from Gary and Dave on the successes of Stockpile Stewardship, because part of today is to celebrate the fact that we have went 20 years without underground nuclear testing and start touching on where we're going to go building on those successes. So, let's see. So the outline I was going to talk to was talk a little bit about stewardship, talk about the work in developing above ground experimental tools. I have a comment there saying don't sweat the small stuff. There's a book there, don't sweat the small stuff, to try to teach you to sort of de-stress. Well, actually in our business we actually do have to sweat the small stuff, and I'll show some examples of the small experiments that are important to Stockpile Stewardship. Computing, I think you've heard a few times already. We can only do our job because of the advances in computing, and I'll give you some examples of that. Talk a little about our predictive capability framework. As a scientist, or former scientist, reforming scientist, however you want to call it, one of the things we do as scientists, we tend to talk about what we don't know and what we're going to discover, not about what we do know and what we have to do in that path. And so the predictive capability framework is a great tool that we've developed to talk as a scientific community and get down on paper, what do we know we have to do? Yeah, there'll be some discovery, there'll be some changes, but we actually document what we have to do, and I'll talk about that. And as Dave introduced and Gary, the fact that there is a quantification of margins to uncertainty gives us the language in which we can express all that science, and that has been an incredibly powerful tool, and so I'll touch on that briefly. I'll talk a little bit about what stewardship has enabled in directed stockpile work, and then some thoughts on where we'll go in the future. So the UGTs that many of you were involved in answered a lot of questions. They didn't answer all the questions, and so in the bottom chart I've got a couple of questions that come up in the, in the 21st century now about nuclear forensics, consequence of executions. As Gary and Dave pointed out, how do you assure the safety and security of weapons as they've aged well beyond the anticipated time that they were going to be in the stockpile? Those are the sort of questions that we wrestle with, and I'll show how stewardship helps us. But one note, 150 kilotons, which is the threshold treaty limit, translates to 600 terajoules. You know, keep that number in your head as we talk about some of the other facilities. And Gary just pointed out, I guess at some point, somebody from Washington mandated that all nuclear yields should be given in SI units, and it caused a lot of concern. But 600 terajoules is 150 kilotons. So what have we done? Let's start with some of our high energy density facilities, because a detonating nuclear weapon exists for most of its time, releases most of its energy in a high energy density physics state, well above 1 million atmospheres of pressure. We now have two major facilities, and I didn't include Omega at the University of Rochester, but Z and NIF have about 2 megajoules of electrical energy or laser energy delivered to a load to create environments to replicate underground nuclear test environments. But 2 megajoules is about 0.5 kilogram of high explosive equivalent. So 600 terajoules, 150 kilotons, we have 2 megajoules. But that's enough for us to do experiments on the scale lengths of millimeters. Big enough to measure, big enough to diagnose, and big enough to be relevant. Small enough to make sure the facility's there for the next shot. So, and we've used those incredibly well. There's just a few examples all across the bottom. We're now taking data from the equation of state of material data at pressures that would previously only been generated by an underground nuclear test with accuracies equivalent to what we could do with a gas gun. That's phenomenal. Nobody would have believed you could have done that. That is happening day in, day out now in the Stewardship program. There's an example of NIF getting diamond up to 30 million atmospheres. They've all pushed up to 50 million atmospheres. That's approaching the pressure at the center of Jupiter. Yeah, phenomenal achievement. And we have now very complicated experiments to study how radiation moves around in complex materials. Very important for stockpile stewardship. Our modern hydrodynamic facilities could not have been imagined in the UGT era, and I double checked that Gary would agree. If anybody else disagrees, you can argue. DART facility can generate 4 very small, very intense X-ray pulses to image implosions. The Jason group that was mentioned with Sidrell and others, when they reviewed DART back in, I think that was 2006 timeframe, concluded that you might get 2 pulses. We don't think you could get 4. We now have 4 pulses that just give exquisite data. The multiplexed photon Doppler velocimetry that was mentioned, which is the sort of Jedi lightsaber in the middle over there, is just giving phenomenal data, as we saw yesterday, and will challenge the sort of codes for a long time. But we tend to always talk about the big experiments. The small experiments are equally important. And so I've just thrown off a few examples of high explosives. A lot of our safety basis for the work done at Pantex across the complex relies on us understanding explosives. A lot of that understanding comes from laboratory experiments. At Heath, explosive facilities at Sandia and Los Alamos as well. We're now putting a new diagnostic on lands to measure nuclear cross-sections, to go back, as Gary said, and reanalyze some of the UGT data, because we could do that much more accurately now and pull out even more data from the UGTs. And the Ion Beam lab that's coming up at Sandia will allow us to study in detail the physics of radiation effects, damage in electronics. Previously, we have done some underground experiments to maybe look at that. Now we can go into detail and actually understand sort of effects on individual junctions. It was a nice segue into the fact that the Science, Technology, Engineering program impacts across the whole complex. It's not just the big experimental tools, it's not just the big computers, but in microelectronics and Y12, Pantex, for testing environmental survivability, we're implementing new capabilities throughout the complex to meet that grand challenge of stewarding the stockpile without underground nuclear tests, and stewarding a stockpile that's getting older. Computing, though, was brought up as one of the major advances. Without a doubt, the graph is basically just showing the size of computing over time. But if you actually look at the photographs, I think it's more experiential. In 1996, the first teraflop facility came online, I think at Sandia, and it fit within a room and used up 500 kilowatts of power. That was a major achievement. The picture on the top is in 2011. It's one of the chief scientists from Intel holding a chip that computes at 1 teraflop and requiring 250 watts of power to drive it. I mean, that is a phenomenal advance over time. And that's what allows us to build computers that go from the very coarse gridded model of a piece of electronics from the stockpile up to a very fine resolution model where you can actually start looking at individual welds and joints and figuring out how they crack. All of that has been possible with computing, and of course right now we've just brought Sequoia online at Livermore at 16 petaflops. And much to the chagrin of all the budget people, we honestly can't say we have enough yet. I know they want us to say that, but we honestly can't. It has transformed the way we do business. A couple of graphs there showing both how we use computing to advance our own experimental tools. Also, the one on the left is a joint in a component that's made by Sandia, where they figured they have to resolve in detail to figure out when that joint would fail under certain environments. We can do that now because we have the ASC tools, and we can do it in 3 dimensions, and we can start to do it in realistic environments. But it's not our own business that we're transforming, we're actually transforming others, as Ray J said. So the bottom, there's a model of a submode anti-tank round that the DoD are now using the same sort of engineering tools, the same sort of engineering discipline, powered by our computing to actually figure out how better to design penetrating warheads. A key thing for us in the STD community is all roads do lead to the stockpile. All the work we do, whether it's in ICF, ASCII, science, engineering campaigns, all have a line of sight to the directed stockpile work, to the stockpile stewardship and management plan. And even if you look at our academic programs, we're training people that are going in to our complex. Actually, in our academic programs, I've drawn an analogy to our the academies, the military academies. It's not you're training people in the right disciplines, you're training those people to be the leaders in the field a decade after they've entered the labs. And I think that's proof positive. The picture is actually of Seth Root, who came out of Washington State, one of our centres, moved to Sandia, and is now doing some of the equation of state work that's critical to future safety surety systems. So it's, I mean, it's a very strong and powerful pipeline. And there's a great article in Scientific American a month or two back that explained why you have to network early to draw the people into the business that we're in, otherwise we're just going to banking. So you might ask, why are we so cruel that we divert them from banking into our business? We need skilled people. The predictive capability framework, I won't talk about it in detail, but it's a method by which all the STD community we talk with the director stockpile work community and actually integrate the work that has to be done, figure out when we can do it. Can we adjust the timing? If Steve Goodrum's got a life extension program in a certain time, what work can we bring forward or slow up to make sure we maximize the benefit to the stockpile? But all of that's possible because we do have QMU. So, you know, there was another book, The 5 Languages of Love. QMU is the one language of assessment. It's, I'm sure Bruce uses that line with his wife all the time. He might not. So, when you were doing an underground test, it was you really had a very easy thumbs up, thumbs down, quite often. How do you communicate an assessment process to people that don't have that easy thumbs up, thumbs down result? And so QMU provided us a great language to get our science into that annual assessment process. And the bottom chart sort of explains it. You know, you have a certain margin. In engineering, you might call it a safety factor to account for the uncertainties. The analogy I always like to explain it is this one. This was a projection for Tropical Storm Gustav. And this is real world because I was on the Alabama coast when Gustav was coming in. And so, depending on the uncertainty of where the tropical storm or hurricane's going, you determine how much uncertainty you've got in that and how much white space you've got. So if you're sitting on the west coast of Florida looking at that chart, you'll figure, I'll get some coffee, sit down, watch CNN, watch Anderson Cooper reporting from the hurricane or tropical storm, I'm good. If you're in the middle of that tropical storm path, you're probably going to evacuate. What do you do at the edges? You make a value judgment based on your uncertainty and how much margin you think you've got. My case, no white space, I evacuated. So fortunately the storm actually went a little bit the other way, and so I didn't have to, but I made the judgment to evacuate. And that's based purely on your margins to uncertainty. We do it all the time, we just tend to not put it in geek terms, but that was a real world example. But every day the labs with the rest of the complex are making those value judgments based on that assessment. What Stewardship accomplished in our direct-to-stockpile work? Well, in 2001, we had a major alteration to a bomb that was done without an underground test. 2003, new manufactured pits. 2004, an ICBM warhead. 2007, a very improved AF&S system was brought in, certified to all environments without an underground nuclear test. 2008, at the very end of that, we hit the first production unit for the 76-1. So Stewardship is enabling us to do our job of supporting the DoD and supporting the President, and so Stewardship has been a great success. We've got a challenge though, as my boss will probably say at the end of this session. We're going to modernise a lot of the stockpile. There's going to be a lot of work on our plate, and we've got to be right. That's going to be a big challenge for us. I think this community can do it. Stockpile Stewardship has transformed future directed stockpile work. I've gone through the lists, all the new models, been able to certify new electronics, new materials, drive the way we sort of invest. A lot of it would not have been possible without ASCII, the experimental tools and engineering tools to validate it. So in conclusion, ST&E fit in all our products. You know, maybe if we turn NIF on the side, it would fit in. No, that's not quite what I mean. 17 cycles of annual assessment, 17 years where the lab directors have had to write a letter to the President saying that, yeah, the stockpile's fine. Life extension programs, alts and mods, new components, new surveillance and understanding of new understanding of UGT and surveillance data, answers to safety and dismantlement questions, new manufacturing methods. All of that work that is seen by the DoD and our external stakeholders have all been driven by the success of Stockpile Stewardship. Stockpile Stewardship has accomplished a lot because it's composed of a lot of accomplished people, which are you and the people on the VTCs listening in. Whether it be a bunch of students getting, at Omega, doing our academic programs, hopefully going to be recruited by the labs 5 years from now, people working in Nevada, people with real hands-on touches to the stockpile, the program has been successful because of you. And so, feel free, if you can download this and put your own picture in there, as a personal thank you from me. But from all of us, we thank you and your families, because it's a lot of time for all the advances in Stockpile Stewardship. Thank you very much. Any questions? No. Yeah. Ray doesn't need to introduce me again, so I'll skip to the next talk, because that talk should have actually been given by Tom D'Agostino, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. So I'll switch to the talk about the Nevada, past, present, and future. So what I was going to do in this one is talk a little bit about what the UGT era that Gary talked about has left us, based on the extensive database, an experimental site with a can-do attitude, and that's going to be the strong theme. It's the can-do attitude of Nevada that has powered its past, its present, and its future. Talk briefly about the stewardship that's then built on that, and then some of the growth areas in other government agency work. I'll just hit on that with a single view graph, and some thoughts on what Nevada will be doing maybe for the next 20 years. When I say can-do, I mean can-do. So this is a brief history, but the atomic detonations in the South Pacific were deemed not to be beneficial to anybody, and so a testing ground, a proving ground was needed in the US. Nevada was selected. It was selected in December 18th of 1950. The Nevada proving ground was selected to be the test site. January 27th, 1951, the first test was conducted. So within 2 months, that's the sort of can-do spirit of Nevada that carries on to this day. But besides can-do, there's an extreme dedication to high-quality engineering, experimental rigor, safety rigor. And so these are just some images from the UGT days showing this amount of diagnostics that had to be fielded, the level of rigor required to lower a massive rack that I can't remember the total weight of, with components sitting on the end down a long shaft. That's a very challenging job to do. The people in Nevada could do it well, with the work, the help from everybody at the labs. Occasionally there were hiccups. There was the event that wasn't meant to happen, but what that taught was a lessons learned, what do we do better, the formation of the containment evaluation panel, for example. So that rigor in doing work, again, was critical to the mission and critical to the future. As it was mentioned, the UGT data is under constant analysis. As I said, there's a new diagnostic coming in to make nuclear measurements, and there's a graph just for the number of common models for UGTs for one side as it's growing up to, approaching hundreds, where we're pulling out more and more UGT data, putting them into common model suites. Very important as we move forward in the stockpile, very important as we look at how we make weapons in the future interoperable, etc. We have to be able to touch on a broad database to support that. You will also find Nevadans, NS Tech people, because of that rigor and the dedication that came from doing work at the test site, working in our big facilities as well. I've used Z and Omega and NIF as an example, because NNSS staff bring great data acquisition skills, skills with diagnostics in extreme environments, fast closures and containment. And so wherever you see that work done in our facilities, you'll probably find some linkage back to the teams at Nevada. But as Gary said, and I think you would have no disagreements from most of the people here, it's all about plutonium as far as for the primary community, understanding plutonium. That need drove some new investments at Nevada, post the UGTs, the subcritical experiments, Jasper. So we built up an infrastructure that was based on that can-do attitude, the rigor that came with that to handle plutonium, dry plutonium, either gas guns or high explosive. And so that has given the Nevada team a strong mission in the subcritical program that we heard some fantastic work from yesterday. Let's see, so this should be the video of the experiment that was done last week. Hopefully. Pollux is a phenomenal data set, and I think this will mark a transition in the future of Nevada and the way we do subcritical experiments here. One of the other big changes during the post-UGT era was we built a new device assembly facility just before underground nuclear testing stopped. And honestly, DAF sat for a while really looking for a mission. Now we're starting to wonder if we have enough space in DAF, because not only does it support the experimental programs with target fabrication at UNE and at Jasper, we've moved our criticality research facilities from Los Alamos and assembled them in Jasper, in DAF. And DAF also has a huge store of some of our nuclear material that we can then let the nuclear forensics groups, the emergency response groups use in real-time training exercises. So DAF has turned into a major support facility for a lot of our nuclear missions. And because of that, you find other government agencies that are coming here. They come to Nevada because it has that can-do attitude. It has the focus on safety rigor, good engineering, designing experiments to return data with 100% accuracy the first time you do it. And so you'll find the experiments for nuclear weapons assessments, transparency, verification, emergency response and hazardous materials. So Nevada has built on that skill set from the underground test era through the subcritical program to really expand into many other mission areas. And that will be key for the future. I think Pollux will mark a change in the way we continue to do subcritical experiments here. In the non-proliferation community, we may hear some of that from Cassia. And other government agency work continues to grow at Nevada. And I think as long as the teams exhibit the can-do spirit, there are many great things they'll do for both international and national and international security at Nevada. So I think that was the last one. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. For the next talk, I'll invite one of our colleagues from across the ocean. The United Kingdom has been a partner with us in this stewardship enterprise from the very beginning. I mean, they were the ones that were cut off in the nuclear. Divider really was a divider for them. IceCap is still a memorial to that. Let me introduce Mr. Martin White, who will speak on behalf of the United Kingdom's community. Martin White is currently the head of the UK Ministry of Defence Strategic Technologies Group, which is tasked with assuring that the UK's defence nuclear science and technology capability, primarily centered at the AWE, the Atomic Weapons Establishment, is developed and maintained at a level consistent with meeting MOD's nuclear deterrent policy requirements, and to provide defence nuclear science and technology support to the broader UK government initiatives. Prior to this appointment, Martin was head of the Nuclear Strategic Deterrent Office at the British Embassy in Washington, where he maintained healthy nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological defense bilateral relationships, ensuring where possible that U.S. policies and programs in the areas of interest were developed in a manner consistent with UK's interests. An important element of his embassy role was to oversee the coordination of the UK-US exchanges, which were conducted under the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. So I'd ask you to please join me in welcoming Mr. Martin White to the podium. Martin.
Thank you, Ray. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues from the NNSA labs, and of course the the Nevada National Security Site, let me start my comments by thanking you for allowing me to join you on this anniversary. I see myself representing all those UK individuals that took part in the UK nuclear testing programme, and particularly those who came to Nevada. Given my tender years, I can only lay claim to involvement in the last two of our planned underground tests. The last one, of course, was never fired, but some of the infrastructure remains as a monument to the programme. I find it quite interesting when I go out there to see how the desert starts to reclaim parts of it. The long snaking runs of large diameter coaxial cables are almost covered with tumbleweed now, and owls are nesting in the tower. And I think it's locked up now, but if you go into the trailers, trailer 9189, there's still actually a UK recording engineer's unclassified notebook laying open on the desk. So quite poignant, I think. I also have to comment that the speed with which you imposed the moratorium back in '91 gave me, personally, something of a dilemma. Having made the appropriate money transfers to the US to cover the cost of support you provided to us, I found we had some $20 million that had to be repatriated, but no mechanisms to do so. We'd never actually got any money back from you. So after much searching, we found a senior clerk in the Federal Reserve Bank who was authorised to write 20 cheques, each up to $999.99. And to the best of my knowledge, you still owe me 20 cents, and it's in an account over there somewhere. As we look back 20 years, I believe we should take a few minutes to reflect on some 70 years of nuclear security collaboration. From our earliest interactions during World War II and the Manhattan Project, where we first came together to address the nuclear threat, and which led to the Trinity test, it is clear to me that nuclear testing has played a key part in enhancing our relationship. The UK's history of independent nuclear testing started with Operation Hurricane in October 1952 on an island off the northwest coast of Australia. Following this, atmospheric tests were carried out in Woomera and Maralinga in Australia, and Morden Islands and Christmas Island in the Pacific Ocean, before the historic signing of the 1958 Mutual Defence Agreement. And when I say historic, I really do mean that. I don't think we can overemphasise the significance of that agreement between our two countries. And that opened the way for us to conduct underground tests at Nevada. The first UK test was codenamed Pampas. That took place in March 1962 and was followed by 23 others, culminating in the Bristol test in November 1991. If you review the names given to the UK UGTs, there are some obvious linkages between the code names that we chose. For example, I think you can easily pick out the references to ghost towns in Darwin, Midland and Barnwell, and birds in Cormorant and Corsa. But I have to say that the connection between such names as Bannon, Quargell and Colwick were completely beyond me until someone pointed out they were all named after smelly cheeses. Our first UK test in Nevada was conducted in collaboration with Los Alamos, but as we're British, and as with cricket, we must seek to play on a level playing field, we adopted a balanced approach. We alternated between Los Alamos and Livermore. And it's always amused me that both of the labs called the other Brand X. However, alternating had its drawbacks. If Lab A, and I have to say I have to thank colleagues from way back then who gave me these little snippets. If Lab A performed a particular evolution one way, then Lab B would have adopted a totally different approach. For example, one big difference facing us was the canister or rack, again depending on which lab, depending on the name, containing the test device. Los Alamos used wire rope harnesses to suspend and lower to the bottom of the emplacement hole. Livermore used a large diameter drill pipe. Los Alamos used a single canister into which the device under test was incorporated, whilst Livermore used a second canister. You can well imagine the impact that had on the hardware we had to bring out from the UK every time we wanted to mount an experiment. Dry runs to test diagnostic status and signals were addressed differently. One lab chose to adopt a policy of false positive logic, and the other chose the opposite philosophy. Downhill and trailer park grounding were also significantly different. But Peter Sankey, who many of you know, reliably informs me that the British view eventually won out and everybody adopted that approach. But whoever we were dealing with, there was tremendous UK-US cooperation. And of course, this included socialising after long days. Although the UK contingent were normally put out of the way up on the Messer 60 miles from Mercury. A national game would be chosen for each test, and towards the end of a stay, AWRE as it was then, and the corresponding lab would compete against each other. We never got the hang of softball though, and cricket remained impenetrable to our US hosts. Mind you, I have to say there are a few Brits who can recollect the 10 ways a batsman can be given out in cricket. And the cricket ball, carefully brought over from the UK, was a mangled mess of cork and leather after 6 deliveries on the baseball diamond. UK policy dictated that carrying out a UK UGT at NTS, that's a nice set of abbreviations, was secret until the head test had been fired. And that clearly is very sensible. However, the policy was somewhat undermined when the UK staff arriving in Vegas after long flights, or in fact I should say flights because we tended to send them on different routes. They would always seek sustenance, and as many of you will remember, visited the Somerset Bar, which I'm told was just across from the infamous Somerset House Motel with its advertised Olympic-sized swimming pool, which in reality was about half the size. But the key thing was they were always greeted by the locals with the exclamation, "The Brits are here to let off another nuke." So the whole purpose of secrecy seemed to be undermined there. Of course, preparation in designing devices for test was always thorough and painstaking, involving numerical calculations and non-nuclear experiments to achieve safety and performance. And by the end of the 1970s, the UK had developed a strong laboratory-based component to the design and validation of UK warheads as a useful adjunct to the limited programme of UK underground tests. This included hydrodynamic experiments, the use of lasers for high energy density physics experiments, and computational modelling following the advent of sufficiently fast computers to run the requisite codes. It's significant that the warhead for the W177, a freefall bomb that existed in a number of variants, Polaris and Chevelin, both submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and the current UK Trident warhead that's deployed in the present-day Trident strategic deterrent, were all developed under this regime, together with the technical collaboration with US scientists and engineers and access to US facilities. It is an essential feature of the certification of these warheads, and hence the credibility of our present deterrent, that the assurance of their safety and performance is firmly referenced to the UGTs carried out at Nevada. Since cessation of testing, the certification of safety and performance has been provided through a warhead science program, which is very analogous in its aims to the US science-based Stockpile Stewardship program. And the UK continues to visit Nevada site as part of its science experimental programme. As many of you are aware, and I noticed the last time I was in the Atomic Testing Museum, the pictures that are up there of the UK subcritical experiment Krakatoa, which was undertaken in February 2008. More recently, the UK and the US conducted the Bacchus experiment in September 2010, which involved Los Alamos, Sandia, NS Tech and AWE. These experiments are a clear demonstration of the UK and US continuing to work to ensure our national programmes have the required data to certify our respective stockpiles. Today, the 21st century national security mission of the Nevada site continues to support our respective in-service deterrents, as well as helping us minimise the multiple conventional threats that we face on a daily basis. In today's political and financial climate, all our experimental and test facilities must deliver their services in an affordable manner. I believe over many years, and no less so in the past few, the UK and US have demonstrated how two sovereign countries can work together on some highly sensitive matters to ensure best value in full trust. I look forward to this interaction continuing and expanding. And finally, I'll close my observations by saying that the testing in our business, is as critical today as it was when we started nearly 70 years ago. Of course, now we limit ourselves to non-yield generating experiments, and these experiments, with Nevada playing its role, are allowing us to take our modern codes in the right direction. But I remind you of what Albert Einstein once said: no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, at the Nevada National Security Site, we should continue to celebrate our successes and, of course, the occasional failure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Next on the agenda, we were going to hear from Ann Harrington, who's a Deputy Administrator for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation at NNSA. However, Ann was not able to join us today. Instead, Kasia Mendelsohn, who is the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Nonproliferation and International Security at NNSA, will make some comments. She's been with the department since 1999 and has served in a variety of leadership roles. And I guess we will, are we ready technically to do this? Okay. So Kasia, over to you.
Ray, I apologize I didn't provide you with much of a biography. I actually started at the department in '99, and my first responsibility was to support CTBT ratification. And even though I failed at that, they kept me around, and that's good things that I can now present today, some 12 years later. I'm just going to go ahead and present Ann's remarks. She worked very hard on these, and she asked that I present them as her. So beginning with that, it's wonderful to be together today to recognize the success of the Stockpile Stewardship Program and the fact that the United States has not conducted a nuclear explosive test in over 20 years. With the work we've seen from across NNSA, we have no need and no plans to conduct such tests in the future. Everyone joining us today from the NNSA sites and our interagency partners has played a part in this remarkable achievement. I also would like to thank Martin White and the delegation from the United Kingdom for joining us. As you heard from Martin, the United Kingdom has been an outstanding partner in both stockpile stewardship and nonproliferation efforts for a very long time. I'd like to talk briefly now about the international implications of ending nuclear explosive testing and what that means going forward. Now that the U.S. presidential election is settled, we have some certainty about plans for arms control and nonproliferation goals for the next 4 years. All of you know what a priority nuclear security is for President Obama, and that prioritization has been invaluable for our work and has put a focus on the necessity of what we do. We've made great progress recently with initiatives to demonstrate our support for a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, but more needs to be done, including in the area of nuclear explosive test monitoring and verification. The administration strongly supports U.S. ratification and early entry into force of the CTBT. As we continue to consult with the members of the United States Senate on how best to move forward on a ratification process, the United States remains committed to maintaining a moratorium on nuclear explosive testing. This year is also the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps the closest point that the world has come to a nuclear war. Coincidentally, 1962 also was the year with the largest number of nuclear explosive tests in history. In fact, during that incredibly tense 13-day period of the crisis alone, the United States and the Soviet Union each executed 7 nuclear explosive tests. And that was the pace of activity at the time. And thankfully, things have changed in a variety of ways. What was routine then does not happen now, and we're all working toward a world where it's simply unthinkable. It's also significant that next year will be the 25th anniversary of the U.S.-Soviet joint verification experiment. The JVE was an unprecedented opportunity for U.S. and Soviet experts to cooperate technically in a sensitive nuclear weapons area, and the JVE contributed greatly to the entry into force of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty in 1990. We plan to work with the Russian Federation to appropriately commemorate that milestone as well, and we hope to build on that experience with the Russians and other willing partners. The spirit of that sort of cooperation lives on today. The United States actively is looking for ways to collaborate with its P5 partners in the areas of arms control and nonproliferation, and we've initiated the dialogue. Right now, within that dialogue, the Chinese are leading an effort to develop a glossary of nuclear-related terms to allow a common understanding across different cultures of terms that are fundamental to our progress in arms control and nonproliferation. Also in the context of this P5 dialogue, the United States has issued an invitation to the P5 countries to visit our former nuclear test site. This measure is offered in the spirit of transparency and confidence building, with no expectation of reciprocity. We have much to learn from each other, and we can never do enough to build trust. The P5 countries, with their experience in nuclear explosive testing and monitoring, have unique expertise to offer in order to enhance the international monitoring and verification effort. Opportunities for P5 cooperation here would not be possible if we did not fundamentally agree on a nuclear explosive test ban. We look forward to more international collaboration across the national security enterprise, not just with P5 countries, but also with non-nuclear weapon states, if appropriate. If countries are sincere in their desire to join in progress towards a nuclear weapons-free world, we would welcome ideas to work towards that goal. We're proud that the United States was the first country to sign the CTBT when it opened for signature in September 1996, and U.S. ratification of the CTBT and its entry into force remains a priority for the Obama administration. With experiments like Pollux that we saw in the clip presented there and also real-time last week, we've proven that our stockpile can remain safe, secure, and effective without nuclear explosive testing, so there's no reason for the United States not to ratify. U.S. ratification of the CTBT is in our national security interest. As stated in the April 2010 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, ratification of the CTBT is central to leading other nuclear weapon states toward a world of diminished reliance on nuclear weapons, reduced nuclear competition, and eventual nuclear disarmament. Even without CTBT ratification and entry into force, U.S. policies and practices are consistent with the central prohibitions of the CTBT, as demonstrated by our long-standing nuclear testing moratorium. However, U.S. ratification of the CTBT would be a significant affirmation of the international nonproliferation regime. The United States, as one of the 183 signatories of the treaty, has contributed significant resources and expertise to improving the state of the international monitoring and verification regime. Next year will also mark a transition at the Preparatory Commission for the CTBT organization in Vienna. Ambassador Tibor Toth has managed the organization through a robust period of growth and improvement in the effectiveness of the monitoring and verification regime. In August 2013, Ambassador Toth will step down as Executive Secretary, and he will be succeeded by Dr. Lissina Zerbo from Burkina Faso, who's headed the International Data Center in Vienna since 2004. The United States looks forward to working with Dr. Zerbo and the Provisional Technical Secretariat to build on the improvements that have been made and to prepare for entry into force of the treaty. We've heard from the previous speakers about the success of the Stockpile Stewardship Program, and we're about to hear from Dr. Cook about the future of the program. But it's because of the dedication of you, the NNSA team, working with our colleagues from the United Kingdom, that we're able to mark this occasion today and to look ahead with confidence. We've all seen the awe-inspiring photos and videos of enormous atmospheric and underwater nuclear explosions, but they should remain as memories. Some of the experts in Nevada and at the NNSA nuclear weapons laboratories played a part in those, and many of them played a large role in executing the many atmospheric and underground nuclear tests at the Nevada test site, the Pacific Proving Grounds, and other locations in the United States. We also want to recognize that many of our experts in nuclear explosive testing have used that expertise to support steps to prepare for the implementation of nuclear explosive test monitoring under the CTBT. We salute the outstanding legacy that got us to the point where we can consider seriously a future without nuclear explosive testing. Dr. Dini described the wide variety of missions today at the Nevada National Security Site, and our ability to repurpose our former test site to support ongoing collaborations in areas such as emergency operations and counterterrorism might not be possible if we were actively testing nuclear weapons there. Without the nuclear testing moratorium, we couldn't even consider some of the promising ideas in stockpile stewardship and nuclear explosive test monitoring that we may want to pursue. Our international credibility is greatly enhanced by maintaining the testing moratorium, giving us the opportunity to advance other non-proliferation objectives as well. As recently noted by Acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, Rose Gottemuller, with a global ban on nuclear explosive tests, states interested in pursuing nuclear weapons programs would have to either risk deploying weapons uncertain of their effectiveness or face international condemnation for conducting nuclear tests. The CTBT would also subject suspected violators to the threat of intrusive on-site inspections, a further deterrent to those states tempted to carry out a nuclear test in the hope that it can be hidden from the international community. The treaty's verification regime has also grown significantly over the last decade. Today, the international monitoring system is close to 85% complete, and when fully completed, there will be IMS facilities in 89 countries spanning the globe. At entry into force, the full body of technical data gathered via the international monitoring system will be available for verification purposes to all states parties. We've come a long, long way since we ended nuclear explosive testing. The emerging CTBT verification system is already at work. It detected the nuclear explosive tests announced by North Korea in 2006 and 2009, and its capabilities will continue to improve as the system is completed. In addition, with the Fukushima nuclear crisis, we've seen the importance of the IMS for non-verification related purposes, such as tsunami warnings and tracking radioactivity from nuclear reactor accidents. CTBT entry into force will also make possible the option for on-site inspection, which will help clarify ambiguities regarding a possible nuclear explosive test. The treaty's substantial verification regime, which supplements the United States' state-of-the-art capabilities for nuclear explosive monitoring, will severely challenge any state trying to conduct militarily significant nuclear explosive tests without detection. We hope that the treaty will soon enter into force and provide legally binding global ban to constrain other countries from testing. The world is a safer and more certain place if nuclear explosive testing is relegated to the pages of history. There was a time when an active and robust U.S. nuclear explosive testing program was necessary to ensure the safety, security, and reliability of the U.S. nuclear weapons program. That time is more than 20 years in the past. Now's the time to redouble our efforts to build a more peaceful world where those nations who believe nuclear explosive testing may lead to greater respect or stature in the international community are roundly condemned, and the national security of the United States and all peace-loving nations is enhanced by maintaining a safe, secure, and effective U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile without nuclear explosive testing. Thank you.
Finally, last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Don Cook. As all of you know, Dr. Don Cook serves as the Deputy Administrator for Defense Programs at the National Nuclear Security Administration. He's responsible for managing the U.S. nuclear security enterprise of laboratories and manufacturing facilities. Prior to his appointment to NNSA, Dr. Cook served as Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the United Kingdom from 2006 to 2009. From 1977 to 2005, Dr. Cook worked in the pulse power sciences, microtechnologies, infrastructure, and security programs at Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Dr. Cook spearheaded the Mesa facility, which was one major addition to our crown jewel of capabilities that have resulted from the stewardship program. and positions Sandia very well for its future on the engineering side of the enterprise. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Cook to give his views and vision of the future of stewardship.
Well, thank you, Ray, and I thank everybody in the audience here and at the sites for enduring this far. I want to thank the speakers so that we do not forget to do that before. And as you will see from my comments, I am focused on the future, but could not be so focused on the future if it had not been for the achievements of the past. So we're here today to do two things. One is to commemorate 20 years since the last underground test, divider, that Gary and others described today. And the second is to celebrate 20 years of successful stockpile stewardship. I'm going to make some comments in that regard that go into the future, that build upon what Christine and Dave Crandall and others have already said, and I will be fairly explicit about what we have to achieve. It's not going to be simple. It is quite clear, and let me begin with the top paragraph here, which is from President Obama's speech in 2009 in Prague. There are two parts to what he said. I've just captured a part here. The first part is an aspiration that we would take concrete steps as a nation toward a world without nuclear weapons. He said as he went on, that will require a fundamental change in society around the world. This is not often remembered. I just thought I'd provide a memory point. He also said, the part that starts with make no mistake, as long as these weapons exist, the U.S. will maintain a safe, a secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary and guarantee that defense to our allies. Unlike many, the American nuclear deterrent covers 31 nations beyond America itself, and that's something that we should never forget. These nations are looking at our every move. When we make no moves, they believe that the deterrent isn't protecting them as well. When we undertake the very hard work to modernize the stockpile, the infrastructure, to train new leaders, other nations are recognizing that as well. If you look at the second major paragraph on this page, it's an unclassified excerpt from what we call NSPD 28, and it says specifically that it is our requirement to conduct R&D on a broad range of safety, security, reliability, and control methods and devices, and so on, and to pursue technologies that render the unauthorized use of U.S. nuclear weapons impossible without their remanufacture. That, again, is an aspiration, but now it's in a policy directive that has existed for a number of years, an obligation. Nuclear posture review itself was classified, but the report was unclassified. What the report says is, again, quite specific. So let me just look at the highlighted parts here. Beyond doing annual assessment, as Christine went into some detail to address, this report says that the U.S. will fund the ongoing life extension program for W-76 that is now at sea, and we continue at the full build level. We would undertake a modernization program of the B-61 warhead, the oldest one that we currently have in the arsenal. We'd initiate a study of life extension program options for the W-78 ICBM warhead and look at the possibility of interoperability of weapons to reduce the technical hedge, although I didn't include that latter part on this chart. Underlying all of this is the ST&E base, vital for stewardship, and I think you all know that. Now, lacking any desire to be oblique about this, I'm going to come to four assertions that tend to drive me in my role, and I would suggest drive all of our complex as well. The first assertion is that we now have the oldest nuclear stockpile that we've ever had. Average age is 26 years and counting. Next year at this time, it'll be pretty close to 27. It's decreasing only at the rate that we're extending the W-76 warheads, and it's increasing at the rate of all of the others. The number at which we're putting new ones into the stockpile remains classified, but I will address numbers shortly. We also have the smallest stockpile since the Eisenhower administration. For clarity of thinking, I'm going to show you the actual chart. So some of you lived this history, as did I. I'll point to the large point was 31,255 nuclear weapons. Let me just round that to, you can pick 30,000 or 35,000. At that level, it doesn't really matter. But that difference is now the entirety of the number of weapons that we have today, both deployed and undeployed. So I want to focus your eyes to the right and say as well that many of the decisions to take reductions here were not covered by treaties. They were covered by agreements between the United States and Russia, which continue to have more than 90% of the nuclear weapons on the face of the earth. But if I draw a line from the far right red point, a number which was declassified in September of 2009 at 5113 weapons, and I draw that all the way over to the left, it crosses in 1957. So not only do we have the oldest arsenal, it's now smaller than it has been at any time since the Eisenhower administration. I hope that clarifies your thinking in what we must achieve. Second assertion then is currently we expend substantial effort, because we must, on understanding the effects of warhead aging. But we desire really to reset the clock. And that's what weapon remanufacturing does. While we remanufacture, it is now not only an aspiration but a requirement that we improve safety and we improve security, going back to NSPD 28, without accepting any reduction in reliability. Third assertion, back to Chris's talk, in the first and Dave Crandall's, in the first 2 decades post the nuclear test era, we built the power tools, to use Chris Deeney's term, of stockpile stewardship. So now looking forward to the next 2 decades, it is time to apply them. I've already said why we need to do that and generally where we need to do that, but now I'm going to be more specific about where. So I'll talk a good deal about the stockpile rather than the infrastructure. Chris has addressed people. Business practices is also on the list, and something in which we just need major improvements within NNSA and Department of Energy and across the nuclear complex to achieve this modernization effort. The fourth assertion, regularizing the activities in stockpile stewardship and management, and so now you will hear that term used regularly, not just stockpile stewardship here and stockpile management here, but it is stockpile stewardship and management. If we can figure out how to do this with, as it must be, an increased budgetary level, but one that can be levelized, then we have a chance of pulling it off without a great deal of upset. Our responsibilities are shared. If you look to the left, you will see the DoD focuses on setting of requirements, weapon delivery systems, and if you look to the right, you will see that the Department of Energy focuses on annual assessment, understanding what is needed for bombs and warheads, the research, the development, the design, the manufacturing, the qualification for entry into use, and when appropriate, decommission and dismantlement. Something that's not often addressed, but I again want to focus on the right side, is the Department of Energy has in statute and law the fiduciary accountability for safety. It never goes away. When we put weapons into the hands of DoD, if anything goes wrong in a safety point, we, NNSA, DOE, are always accountable. I just ask that you think about that in everything you do in the coming years. All right, quick survey of what we have. Today's nuclear stockpile and delivery systems are here. Lower left on the chart is the sea-based leg, 76 and 88. The lower right is the land-based ballistic systems, the 78 and the 87. And all of the other elements on this chart are air-delivered systems in the third leg of the triad. Both the weapon delivery systems and the weapons themselves now need to be transformed to meet the priorities that we have ahead. So a bit more focus on the weapons themselves. None of this is classified. This is widely available. If you look at these systems, first for the bombs and cruise missiles, what you can see is that the technology that we have in these systems now ranges on the low side from 25 years old to 35 and in some cases even 40 years old. So the challenge that lies ahead to apply the tools of stockpile stewardship is in fact the future of stockpile stewardship. It's going to be a great deal of judgment and application. Ballistic missiles looks like this. The sea leg is at the left and right edges. The land leg is in the middle. Similar comment exists on the age of these systems. All right, so how are we going to do this? Two big blocks of work. We're going to sustain the stockpile. If you look, that means maintenance, alts, mods, and life extension programs. And the block below that is we're going to sustain the workforce and the infrastructure. So very highly specialized technical workforce, that would be you. And we must develop the capabilities, the facilities, and so on. Another way of looking at our work as we go ahead. The top focuses on having continual surveillance and performance assessments that will help us underpin reliability and our judgment calls. The bottom one is we use the surveillance data in certification and in annual assessment of the state of health of the stockpile. And the middle one is based on the top and bottom. We actually formulate the work that we need to do in the life extension programs. I heard a comment one time before I switch to the next chart. Well, I'll switch. You can read and listen at the same time for sure. It may be asynchronous, but give it a shot. You know, we've talked about weapon aging for so long that some people have said, you know, you talk about weapons like they're in an old age home, like you're just barely keeping them alive. And, you know, I think we've actually done that. So now what I'm signaling, we're signaling is the future of stockpile stewardship is to change that perspective, to modernize without introducing new failure modes. Now this chart, I'm just going to use a couple of words, but I'd say what we're doing with weapons is a lot like going to the doctor these days. Not if you're very aged, but if you're a normal person. So let's look at some of the words. The first block, advanced computational models, in-depth evaluation of components and materials. The next block, high-resolution CT scans. We're applying those to weapons. We do it at a couple of places. It's a new tool. Next one, we replace limited life components. Our objective, however, is more broad than just replacing the bits and pieces. You know, a knee joint here and a hip joint there. We really want to remanufacture systems or will not reset the clock. And so that's a shift. Sustainment, very important, but the bottom is kind of an aha, and I'm going to tell you why. Proactive planning, the integration of alphabet soup, the stockpile stewardship and management plan, the predictive capability framework, and the component maturation framework is where we're headed. So how does that all fit together? Well, it's like this. And if you look from left to right, getting the requirements right is one of the biggest parts of the job. Getting the requirements right late is not what we must do. We've got to get the requirements right early. We have to set priorities. There's not enough budget available to do the work if we don't. Then the third block over is pretty complex. I'm going to flash a couple of screens, but not go into depth on that. And all of this together results in stockpile modernization, which I've said is our objective for application of stockpile stewardship. So Chris addressed the predictive capability framework, which is kind of the unifying framework for everything in the area of science and stockpile stewardship. In Steve Goodrum's area, we've also, and labs and plants, we've done considerable work over the last couple of years on a component maturation framework. That's the unification of engineering, of readiness, of preparing readiness to manufacture by understanding what it is we need to manufacture. So to repeat a slide drawn a different way, this is the predictive capability framework. The vertical bar shows where we are today. There are some accomplishments to the left and right. The component maturation framework is a bit scarier. There are even more bits on it. And now there are some achievements to the left. But if you look at the ratio of the required achievements to the right in technology maturation compared to what we've done, it's overwhelming. It's only because of Steve's clear-minded thinking and steady disposition that he's not panicked about this. So that's the requirement. Now, these, again, as Kasia said, and as Christine has said, we are moving into transparency. This is essential because without understanding what it is we have to do with congressional staff, we won't get the budget. None of this is classified, but it surely points to what we have to do to get these weapon systems more modern in terms of safety and security. Looking at this, I'm giving you a number of perspectives and ways to look at this. Let me use this one. Now you see basically what we call the 6X process. Everything is a life extension. There are no nuclear warheads. We're going to live within the boundaries of the underground test record, which exists and is applied every day. But there are these phases. So phase one is sort of get the requirements and do the first level conceptual design. Phase two, you move into looking at feasibility, alternatives, and cost. Phase three, you're into development engineering. Phase four is production engineering. Phase five is getting to the first production unit, and six is in full manufacturing. The lower left says we're going to use our tools to actually inform our decision making ahead of time and determine what it is we must do and aid that with what's possible. You see the component maturation framework comes into phase 6.3 and 6.4 for heavy application. It shows up earlier, but that's where it's applied. And now you see again, predictive capability framework comes in later again. Over at this point. And that's because we need to certify these things before entry into service. So the first block is as I said, what's needed and what's possible. Second block, component maturation framework, is really what is achievable and can we develop it. And this block is really about how well can we manufacture and how much confidence do we have in these items. Now another thing before showing you some photographs. The W76 is right here. It's in full-scale manufacturing. In the past 6 months, we've moved as a complex the B6112 consolidation of 4 families of the B61 weapon system into full-scale development engineering. We've also done that for the W88 arming, fusing, and firing system. And life extension options for the W78 and 88 are here in 6.2a. On one of Chris's charts, there was a comment about 80% of the stockpile. We have today, beyond phase 6.1, more than 80% of America's nuclear deterrent moving through life extension programs. So for anybody who believes we're studying and eventually will do something, that's nonsense. So biggest need now between stockpile stewardship and stockpile management is very good alignment, thinking all the way through. Stephen Covey, who died in the last year, had 7 habits. Some of the two that I recall, besides the others, are one, begin with the end in mind. What we're trying to lay out here for you is we can envision the end, and it's going to be a modernized American nuclear deterrent. It will not just be more and more aging weapons. But another principle of Stephen Covey's was first things first. And that's where we are in looking at the application of the tools now. So, W76, fully in manufacturing. We will conclude the builds, if there are not other policy decisions, by 2021. B-61 Life Extension Program, you know, if you look at the chart to the right, what you will see are the kinds of parts from the 1960s and 70s. You won't see parts from the 1980s, the 1990s, the aughts, and now we're into the teens. So just to let the you know, the depth of the work settle in, that's kind of where we are. But now we're in full-scale engineering for the 6112. If you look at this, I will say is the current chart of stockpile life extension, but this is an area of pretty strong debate, some renewal, and looking at doing interoperability that actually doesn't show in these charts between this line here, which is W78, and this line here, which is the W88. So modernizing the stockpile in a way that is affordable and achievable is high on our mind. The last slide I wanted to show you is just a summary of these two things. So the first one, and Kasha Mendelson in Ann Harrington's remarks said, with the election now over, the policy is fairly clear. The administration said that if it continued under President Obama, there would be a quadrennial defense review, but there would not be a need for a new nuclear posture review. That is the case. And so we know what we need to do, we know where we are in it, and now we need to achieve it. The second bullet says now integrating these two parts, the stockpile stewardship and the stockpile management plan, provide a roadmap for the advanced science and technology development that's required to maintain the safety and security and reliability of the stockpile. But I've already emphasized we're also going to improve the safety and security because we know we can, we believe we know how to do it, and it is a requirement that we pursue ways to do that. Back to you, back to the complex. You are the people who are going to execute this. You have been the source of the ideas. In government, we don't originate a great deal of things. You should be thankful for that. We do consolidate a lot of things, the best ideas from the labs, the best ideas from the plants. But we don't live in a world where it's either the labs are healthy or the plants are healthy. We live in a world where the labs and plants have to be adequately healthy to deliver a stockpile. This stockpile at the end of underground testing was fairly new. We're now 20 years later with an average life of 26 years. It is time to reset the clock. I look forward to all of you doing that, and I want to thank you for what you've done over the last several years. And being here at Nevada, I will say personally and directly, I am exceptionally pleased with the good work on the subcritical experiments, the work done at Nevada, by Los Alamos, elements from Sandia, elements from Livermore, but the series, Gemini series, which is now concluded, could not have been done without just a massive team effort. And I'm delighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And in closing, I guess I'd like to offer a few personal remarks. We talked about at the beginning whether were we celebrating something, were we commemorating something. Clearly we're commemorating an important event in many of our professional lives, which was the end of underground testing as we knew it at the time. But one can also observe, I think, from the talks that we heard today, as well as the talks we heard, some of us, yesterday, that there is something special that still lives 20 years from that day. Johnny Foster, actually, we spent a few minutes talking before coming to the proceedings here today, and he gave me a wisp of an idea which I would like to use as an ending theme. If we're going to judge, and Johnny mentioned the importance of keeping alive a sense of enterprise, groups of people working together in common purpose. And sometimes, there are always going to be disagreements, arguments, technical disagreements, institutional friction, whatever. That's always been part of the nuclear weapons program. But in the end, it is that sense of enterprise. And so, on that note, I can say that on September 23rd, 1992, I personally was sitting in the control room when they pushed the button and we had the divider event. Wow, this really did give you a feeling of enterprise. But I need to say, and since that time, I hate to say I haven't had that kind of an experience for lots of personal reasons, as well as what we've been talking about for the last 20 years. But I did have in this new role a chance to be there in the control room for the execution of Castor. I couldn't be there for Pollux for personal reasons, but Castor was a dress rehearsal. And what's amazing is that even though the conditions had changed, we were in CP1 in September, now our control room was down there underground, right next to, very close to the 0 point. There were I didn't see a red button, anywhere. And yet, when that event went off, there was this feeling and awareness of sense of enterprise. But that sense of enterprise, the fact that there are so many people involved, different organizations, even operating as a nuclear facility, which those of you can appreciate, in 1992, test director was God, right? Whatever the test director said happened, and nobody cared about, some of this other compliance stuff. We went there, got our job done. Now, it is truly bureaucratically a different world out there. But what I was amazed at personally was the fact that the crew that got together to do this, and it was a multi-organizational effort, went through all of the steps of being a nuclear facility and still executed that thing right on the nose. So if we're going to judge the last 20 years, we can judge it on various different scales. But that sense of enterprise and pride and achievement, I can personally testify was there. And so we've come a long way in 20 years. And, I'd like to thank, again, as MC of today's event, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to future successes that Stewardship program will bring with all the challenges that Don has shared with us. Want to congratulate everyone who played a role in this significant 20-year milestone. And yes, we're still here, and we still can take a lot of pride in what we do. So thank you all, and I'll close the proceedings.